just right up front all three of the speakers, and then we will simply go. Each will speak one after the other that way, rather than having introductions immediately before each one. Joining us today, we have Sonal Jessel, Christy Ebby, and Stephen Latham. Sonal Jessel is Director of Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice. She is responsible for advancing the organization's policy agenda at the local, state, and national levels. In addition to leading the New York City's policy initiatives and the Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan. Prior to joining We Act, she conducted research in energy insecurity, housing, and public health at Columbia University, and coordinated clinical trials at Weill Cornell Medicine. With roots in California and Connecticut, Sonal has an MPH in population and family health, with a concentration in climate health from Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. She will be speaking first, and followed by Christy Ebby, who will be joining us virtually from University of Washington, where she's professor of global health, environmental and occupational health sciences, where she's been conducting research in the practice of health risks and climate variability and climate change for 25 years. She focuses on understanding sources of vulnerability, estimating current and future health risks of climate change, designing adaptation policies and measures to reduce risks in multi-stressor environments, and estimating the health co-benefits of mitigation policies. She has supported multiple countries in Central America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the Pacific in assessing their vulnerabilities and in implementing adaptation policies and programs. And then third will be Stephen Latham, who is the director of Yale's Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics. He's a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School and UC Berkeley's doctoral program in jurisprudence. Dr. Latham is a former healthcare business and regulatory attorney. He served as director of ethics standards at the AMA before entering academia full time. He is a fellow of the Hastings Center and has been a graduate fellow of Harvard's Safra Center on Ethics and a research fellow at the University of Edinburgh's Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities. At Yale, Latham teaches about bioethics and environmental ethics in the college and co-chairs the Embryonic Stem Cell Research Oversight Committee and does clinical ethics consultation at the Yale New Haven Hospital. He's a former board member and secretary of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, from which he received a Distinguished Service Award in 2010. So without further ado, I'll introduce that our first speaker will come up, Sonal Jessel from We Act. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I'm happy to be here. Again, my name is Sonal Jessel. I'm the Director of Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice. We are a community-based organization based in West Harlem in New York City. And since 1988, we have been fighting to build healthy communities, particularly for people of color and people of low income. We Act has multiple branches to us. We do community organizing directly in the neighborhoods of Harlem, Washington Heights, and Inwood. All are considered Northern Manhattan if you're familiar with New York City. And we also engage in a lot of environmental health research with academic partners, as well as the side that I work on, which is our policy work. And so we do policy at the city, state, and federal levels. We Act has been recognized as one of the national leaders in the environmental justice movement, and we engage in a wide variety of topics within the umbrella of environmental justice. So today, I'm sorry, I don't have visuals, so I'm just going to talk us through a little bit and not take too much time so we have ample room for discussion. But today I'm just going to be talking about extreme heat as an example of a pressing climate change and health issue, and using React as an example of how you engage community in the process of creating policy to address what we consider to be a very systemic issue that creates disparities with extreme heat exposure and impact. And I'll leave it to Christy to give more information on the bigger conversation around the relationship between climate change and health. So to start, environmental justice. I've always learned to define things before I start talking. Environmental justice simply means that every person, every neighborhood deserves a clean and healthy place to live, work, play, pray, and learn. It's based in the idea that there are disproportionate exposures to environmental hazards, as well as disproportionate benefits from clean environment. And that's based in the idea that environmental racism exists, that there are policies, programs, practices, we're talking systemic, institutional, interpersonal, where there is discrimination in how those decisions are made, and therefore we see a disparate impact of climate change and environmental hazards on specific communities. Extreme heat, a rising issue, particularly for New York City. Extreme heat is a rising problem because we live in a city. We have lots of buildings, we have lots of traffic and pollution. And so we have what is called an urban heat island, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, where we see much higher temperatures in the neighborhoods that we serve than in areas that are suburban or more rural, that are surrounded by more greenery and fewer buildings, and fewer sources of heat and emissions. So with the urban heat island, we see between, I think the average is around 7 to 10 degrees hotter in New York City. But that also is not equal across the city, and that's why React works on this issue. Certain neighborhoods in New York City, and this is true of other cities as well, see higher temperatures on average than other neighborhoods. And that is where we come in when we examine what are the underlying drivers of that disparity. And in particular, neighborhoods that are lower income and that are communities of color have on average higher temperatures than others. So one of our main examples is East Harlem. If any of you are familiar with Northern Manhattan, East Harlem lies on the east side of Manhattan. It's right on the water. It's very low land, and it is particularly an area that has a lot of truck traffic, a lot of bus traffic. It has very few trees, not a lot of green space. It's very concrete in comparison to other parts of the city that have large old trees lining the streets. I'm sure we've all seen all the beautiful pictures of brownstone New York City. And the housing is very old and not as well maintained as in other neighborhoods. East Harlem is also home to the highest concentration of public housing buildings in New York City. And public housing in New York City houses about 600,000 people across the city. It is bigger than some small countries or states, or however you want to compare it. We have a huge population of people that live in public housing, and that particularly is a set of buildings that are quite poorly maintained. So putting all of that together, we have a really high heat vulnerable neighborhood because of all these different aspects of the built environment. It's not just the built environment though, it is socio-demographic indicators that create health vulnerability, and that's why another reason why we see a huge disparity. So East Harlem is a low income community, is predominantly populated by Latino, Asian, and Black and African American communities in that order. And there's a high population of people that are monolingual Spanish speakers, and that there's a lower educational level on average in the neighborhood, and lower income level. And so you put all of that together and you have a demographic vulnerability that's factored into an understanding of extreme heat vulnerability, because we know that your placement in this world means you're able to access the things you need to protect yourself, or able to prepare for extreme weather events like heat waves. So what we see from an example like East Harlem is overall in New York City, the over a 10-year period of time, the 50% of deaths from extreme heat were Black and African American people in New York City, even though they make up only about 25% of the population. So there's a huge disparity in who's being impacted by extreme heat. And this all comes down to the factors that I just outlined of built environment and socio-demographic vulnerabilities. So we took a reporter out to East Harlem. We have an extreme heat tour where we take people through East Harlem and point out all of the different reasons why East Harlem has a much higher heat vulnerability than, say, the Upper East Side, which is right below it, which does not have a high vulnerability at all. And the reporter took a temperature reading and found about a 10-degree difference between the street in the Upper East Side and East Harlem, just on an average hot day. And that really showed that it's really important to not look at temperature on a bigger scale, but you have to look at it street by street, because we saw that there was huge variability in how people were being exposed, because ultimately that's what determines health impacts. So if you have a corner of East Harlem, for example, has a sanitation truck depot where a bunch of sanitation trucks are parked. They also spew terrible PM 2.5 and other exhaust. And then next to it is the back of a hospital, which is covered in generators. And then across the street is a school. And that intersection was the intersection that was reported to be around 10 degrees hotter than an average intersection on the Upper East Side. And so not only do we see high heat levels, but we're also seeing this, this huge health impact where children on this corner are being exposed to all sorts of air pollutants that then leads to asthma. And in the United States and New York City, asthma is one of the leading causes of school absenteeism. So it does have really long-term impacts when children are exposed to poor air quality over a lifetime. So what did we do about it? We planned a series of meetings with community members, and this is called our Heat, Health, and Equity Initiative, where we went to all the different neighborhoods that we serve. So that's East Harlem, Central Harlem, West Harlem, Washington Heights, and Inwood. And we asked people, is extreme heat a problem for you? If it is, why? Please tell us, like, what do you think are the pressing things that contribute to your vulnerability to extreme heat, or your just increased concern about extreme heat? And really left it as like a very open question, because we really didn't want to impose what we thought the answer was on people. And the number one thing that came up was the need for ACs and cooling in homes. And so that's what led us to form our Heat, Health, and Equity Initiative on the idea that everyone deserves to have a sustainably cooled home. And that's what we're ultimately working for when it comes to extreme heat. We're also doing work on, more trees, green parks, make sure we have cooling centers. We're focusing on all of that too. But ultimately what we found is what people need most is that safety in their homes. And in particular, that's true in New York City, and it's been proven by research from the Department of Health that found that around 80% of the heat deaths were of people that didn't have their AC on or didn't have an AC at all in New York City. I don't remember which year that was done, but it's semi-recent. And so that tells us that this is the main focus that we need to have when it comes to how we're addressing heat. this is where environmental justice starts to become a little bit different from general environmentalism, where we have a lot of people coming to us saying, why are you promoting the use of ACs? They're inefficient, they're clunky, they're polluting, they use fossil fuels in New York City. This is going in the wrong direction. But for us, we are concerned about, first and foremost, the health of community. We're concerned about needing to have, in addition to long-term solutions to our heat problem, which is reducing emissions, reducing pollution, but ultimately we need to have these short-term solutions that protect people in the everyday, because the communities that we work with are the communities that are getting hospitalized for extreme heat. They are also the communities that have more chronic health issues, which create bigger risk around extreme heat. So cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, and also people that are working outdoors all day, construction workers, food delivery workers, and people that live in homes that are poorly maintained and don't have the cooling that they need at all. So we ultimately see that this is like a very good example of where environmental justice as a movement breaks off from environmentalism in the simplest form. So what we're doing at WeAct is we have a couple really clear policy goals that we're working towards to help alleviate this issue that's informed by the community that we represent. So the first is the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. This is a federal program. For those of you that know it, it is a pot of money that is given to every state, and then the states distribute these funds as a general assistance program. Works very much like food assistance programs like SNAP and WIC. And ultimately what it can do is pay for people's utility bills, or subsidize at least people's utility bills in the winter or cooling months. New York's program, however, has chosen to subsidize winter heating bills and not summer cooling bills. New York's program for the cooling months provides a free AC or up to an $800 value every 5 years. That is their cooling program. So we have low-income families that apply for this program for the summer. They get an AC once every 5 years, and that's all they get in terms of assistance. And so what you have now are people that might have one AC in their living room, they're missing one in their bedroom or their child's room, and they also can't afford to run it because the utility bills in New York City are also extremely high, and that's also true across the country, especially these days. And so people just don't run them. So WeAct is working towards increasing funding for the Home Energy Assistance Program nationwide, but also really focusing in on how the state has their formula where their programming doesn't allow for the cooling assistance. And that's what we're really working towards as more of a short-term solution, because ultimately we don't want to be having people use clunky, inefficient fossil fuel using ACs. That's not our ultimate goal, but that is what we need in the short term. Then secondly, in the long term, this has brought us to focus a lot on building decarbonization, energy efficiency, and electrification. And these are all part of our longer term solutions to extreme heat, particularly for protecting people's health in heat waves. And so we work on a number of different coalitions at the city and the state and the federal level, all aiming towards how do we make sure that people that are lower income, that live in affordable housing, particularly for us as renters, are able to get their homes to be more efficient and able to use technology that does not pollute as much and ultimately electrify their homes and run on renewable energy. For us, that means a couple things. We work really hard to expand community solar as a solution to building a more resilient energy system and a more democratic energy system, where we try to install solar on rooftops across different apartments in northern Manhattan, and then that can power different households around the area. At this point, it's leading to around a 10 to 15% utility bill reduction, which is great, and it tends to not have as many brownouts as Con Ed gives us, but it's not quite enough, so it's one step. And the other thing that we're really working towards is ultimately the state and the federal government doing a lot of work to invest in low-income households around energy efficiency, which can be quite low cost to make really impactful changes to reduce utility bills and create a healthier indoor living condition. And then lastly, our studying around how to electrify low-income housing. That's a big question because, you know, it can be a very, very expensive endeavor. Renters also do not have that choice. They're not the ones that get to decide what their building makeup looks like. But we need to figure out how to address that issue since buildings are the #1 source of air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in New York City. And so we are doing a pilot project called Out of Gas in with Justice, partnered with Buffalo, New York. And what we are doing is we have switched out gas stoves for electric induction stoves in 10 apartments in a public housing building up in the Bronx, and are studying the air quality reductions or air quality improvements, sorry. And basically the attitudes, behaviors, different just thoughts that people have around moving away from a gas stove, because a lot of people, I'm sure if you kind of work in this area, have heard people say, we love our gas stoves, we don't want to get rid of them. But we're finding that to not really be the case. People really like their electric induction stoves. And so this is part of our process of understanding how can we actually make sure that low-income households and renters and people that have been left out of the discussion for so long are centered in a response around how are we addressing extreme heat, how are we also addressing climate mitigation in the long term. I will stop there and happy to take questions when we're all done. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a great start to things. So I am now going to turn it over to Professor Christy Ebby, who is going to be presenting to us virtually, and will join us also for questions virtually with the panel afterwards. And Bill, great, your slides are up. And so without further ado, Professor Ebby.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation and congratulations on a really interesting conference. Really appreciated the talks I've listened to so far. I'm going to do a broad overview of the health risks of and responses to climate change. Look forward to the questions at the end. I never believe that everything is completely clear. I want to start with the right. It's framing that's used in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and has been used for the last decade. That as we're looking into the future, we're looking at risk, where risk is probability times consequence. The three main components of risk are the hazards created by a changing climate, who or what is exposed to those hazards, and the underlying vulnerability, where vulnerability in the human health sphere includes susceptibility and the capacity to manage. The figure on the left shows you what you know about how increasing greenhouse gas emissions is changing our weather patterns, rising sea levels, and a range of other factors in our environment. Importantly, those factors interact with a wide range of demographic, socioeconomic, environmental, and a whole range of other variables that affect the magnitude and the pattern of risks. Underneath this, you can see the kinds of exposure pathways that we typically look at in environmental health. And underneath that, examples of health outcomes. There's a very long list of climate-sensitive health outcomes. As you look at that list, you see that they cut across the kinds of line departments in departments and ministries of health. Ministries of health, for example, typically have a department focusing on maternal and child health, a separate one looking at vector-borne disease, a third one looking at disaster risk management for extreme events. So climate change cuts across everything that a department and a ministry does and will ultimately influence how we deploy population health here and around the world. I have some text-dense slides. I apologize for that. I know we're not supposed to do this, but I wanted to summarize the latest human health chapter from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report from Working Group 2 that looks at impacts and adaptation, was released at the end of February. And you can see the headline, finding that climate change is already causing excess morbidity, mortality around the world, and is affecting the mental health of people where we have publications to assess. I highlighted in a lighter shade of blue major categories for which we have literature: extreme weather and climate events, water, foodborne diseases, vector-borne diseases, zoonotic diseases, mental health. Also looking at cardiovascular respiratory distress, particularly associated with heat waves. And as well, looking at how climate change is affecting access to health services. And there's some pretty significant disruptions in many places around the world. When you look at this list, we put on this list where we have high or very high confidence statements. This doesn't mean that they are the most important. Underinvestment in research in this area means that there's many areas that are unexplored or only minimally explored. And by underinvestment, the average of funding on climate change and health from NIH for the last couple of decades has been 0.02 to 0.04% of their budget. I'm going to run through some of these climate sensitive health outcomes, make a few points to hopefully catalyze some discussion later on. Every year, NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, tracks billion-dollar disasters. These are for 2021. You can see through September, there was 18 of them. The total cost to the US was somewhere in the range of $30 to $50 billion. So when people say it's too expensive to address climate change, the answer is we can't afford to pay this every year. And these are just the billion-dollar disasters. They're not the $100 million disasters, the $10 million disasters. They're just a tiny fraction. And further, they're billion-dollar disasters because they affect infrastructure. These estimates of the cost of these disasters do not include the cost to human health and well-being. One issue I'd like to highlight, I mentioned before, mental health. This is from research done several years ago at Public Health England after massive flooding in the southeast of the country. And very usefully, this research separated out people who lived in a residence that was flooded versus disrupted. Floodwaters came to the front door, didn't come in, versus not flooded. You can see the very large difference in the prevalence of mental health problems across these three groups. These people have been followed up 3 or 4 years now. The 3-year publication showed a very large decline in the prevalence of these mental health problems, but there were still differences across these groups. So the costs from the mental health impacts of extreme weather and climate events, although unestimated, is extremely high. Exposure to extreme weather and climate events continues to increase. This is from the Lancet Countdown. I don't understand, I keep putting a little text box in the bottom saying this is from the Lancet Countdown 2021, and it just disappears when I present it. Anyway, so this shows you exposure to heat. You're going to talk about heat more later in the conference, and shows the trend for adults over the age of 65 and for children under the age of 1. Both groups are particularly susceptible to heat waves. You can see the numbers that in 2020, there was 3.1 billion more person days of heat wave exposure than over the long-term average. So very clear increase in exposure. And that exposure matters. Our bodies don't handle high temperatures particularly well. Our bodies have a range of mechanisms to try and keep our core body temperature within a pretty narrow range. We also undertake behavioral actions that we go and try and find a place that's shadier. We try and find a way to cool down. And if the actions that we take and our internal mechanisms are insufficient, then those higher temperatures start affecting our cells and our organs. You can see that heart disease, many people have underlying heart disease, but the strain on the heart from that additional heat is often fatal. When you look after a heat wave at the number of excess deaths, about half of those excess deaths are from heart disease. And those are people who would not have died anyway. So essentially, all of the deaths in a heat wave are preventable. There's a formal process called detection and attribution that looks at how much of an impact you can attribute to climate change itself, not just to weather, but to actual climate change. This is work by Anna Vicedo for 43 countries, looking at the proportion of heat-related mortality attributed to human-induced climate change. The overall proportion is almost 40%. Lots of variability, but a significant contribution every summer to the number of people who die. These are where there was possibilities from the literature we assessed in the human health chapter to look at projected impacts. Again, these are for high and very high confidence statements. You can see a much shorter list of climate sensitive health outcomes that we looked at. We just don't have the literature. Most of the literature is on heat waves, although there is a fair amount of literature on dengue and malaria. There's also beginning literature on mental health. One projection to highlight, I know you're talking about heat, is a study by Drew Schindel that very usefully separates out projections where adaptation's incorporated, the top panel, versus no adaptation on the bottom panel. And then also did the projections under high greenhouse gas emissions, the column on the left, modest emissions, the column in the middle, and real aggressive emission reductions on the right. And from this, you can see the interaction between adaptation and mitigation and how critically important it is to do both. Also, you'll see that even under a scenario of adaptation and aggressive greenhouse gas emissions, we are going to see an increase in heat-related mortality. This is what we call residual risk, or in the language of the UNFCCC, this is loss and damage, that we're not going to be able to protect everybody as much as we try, that we're still going to have to increase the resilience of our health systems to manage additional injuries, illnesses, and deaths from a changing climate. Vector-borne diseases, I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but the point of the slide is that when we look at vectors, we look at mosquitoes, we look at ticks, temperature and precipitation affects their development, survival, and reproduction. In addition, the pathogens that we're concerned about, dengue fever, for example, temperature affects their replication and then ultimately their transmission. So modeling this is somewhat complicated because you have to model both how changing weather patterns could affect the vectors, but also then how they would affect the pathogens. One example is projections came out several years ago looking at Aedes aegypti. It's the major mosquito in the US that can carry dengue fever, Zika virus, chikungunya, and yellow fever. These are modeled data. Vector control in the US is at the state level. So there's quite a lot of variability from state to state. But based on a lot of research that's been done about the environmental determinants of where you see this mosquito, the map on the left shows you in the beige area where one would expect to see Aedes aegypti today. The red area is projections out towards the end of the century of where Aedes aegypti could expand to. I live in Seattle. Projections are, Seattle could have Aedes aegypti towards the end of the century. You can also see a little bit up around the Great Lakes, south of Michigan, and big expansions in the Northeast. But it's not just having the mosquito present. You also have to have a summer that's hot enough and long enough that if dengue is introduced into the population, you can have transmission. So you can see on the right, there would still be an expansion in the geographic range, but nothing like what's projected on the left. Nothing in Seattle, which should provide some assurance. You can see that many areas of the country would not, under this projection, see dengue fever. However, about 4 years after this study was published, breeding colonies of this mosquito were found in Toronto, Toledo, and Detroit. Like so much in climate change, we are under projecting the rate at which we're starting to see change in our environment and what that's going to mean for our health. Likely the biggest impact of a changing climate is going to be on food security. This is a figure from the latest IPCC report showing projected changes in crop yields for maize, rice, and wheat. I'm not going to focus on soybeans. Soybeans are a legume and really are quite a bit different than our cereal crops. The top panel is yield change mid-century. The bottom panel is at the end of the century. And you can see for these three main cereal crops, large declines in crop yields. The extent of the decline depends on the greenhouse gas emissions. The low emissions are in dark blue, the high emissions are in the red. But overall, large declines in crop yields. And these are going to occur in the regions of the world that currently are facing high levels of food insecurity. Food insecurity has been declining over the last several years until the last year or so. And food insecurity is on the rise again. Food and Agriculture Organization estimates around 800 million people are food insecure. And I should mention that rice and wheat together compose more than 50% of the calories consumed around the world, including the poor in our own country. The other main pathway by which we're going to see impacts on food security is through higher concentrations of carbon dioxide itself. All of our plants have mechanisms to bring in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and through the photosynthetic pathway, break it apart into carbon and oxygen and use that carbon to grow. 85% of our plants use one particular pathway. The biochemistry of that pathway means that these plants are called C3. The other major one is a C4. And C3 includes rice, wheat, barley, potatoes, many of the foods we consume, grasses, trees, many of our fruit trees. So major category. There's been field experiments with wheat and rice. We've got a field of wheat or rice, you divide it into plots, and some of the plots you blow carbon dioxide over. These are concentrations of carbon dioxide expected later in the century. And in fact, that higher concentration of carbon dioxide does promote plant growth. CO2 is a plant food. But you can see at the same time, you have more carbon in the plant and you have less nitrogen in the plant. And that means you have a reduction in the nitrogen-based compounds. And that's why you see a reduction in protein by about 10%, and the reduction of B vitamins is very large, about 30%. Also, because these plants are more water efficient, they bring in less water from the soil. That means they draw in fewer micronutrients, and that's why you see a decline about 5% in micronutrients. I mentioned about 800 million people in the world are food insecure. About 2 billion have micronutrient deficiencies. About 1.5 billion women and girls have iron deficiency anemia. So this pathway is going to be critically important for food insecurity. Although the projections of what just changes in CO2 could mean project that hundreds of millions of people will be affected by this pathway, in addition to all the people that will be affected by changing temperature patterns. I wanted to spend a moment on a figure that's been iconic from the IPCC since 2001. Let me tell you how the figures are constructed. We'll start with on the 0 line, those are pre-industrial temperatures. The y-axis is increases in global mean surface temperature above pre-industrial. The dots are level of confidence in the transition from one color to another. They're fairly distracting, but the program we use to generate these, we can't really modify the size of these dots. When you look at each column, the white area is where it's not possible scientifically to say whether there's been a change, for example, in heat-related mortality. We just don't know. It could have changed, but we don't have long enough data series, or could not have changed. When the color turns to yellow, it means, in fact, that heat-related mortality has shifted, and that at least part of that shift is due to climate change itself. When the color turns to red, it means the risks are high. When the color turns to purple, it means the risks are very high. And so as you look across these 4 climate-sensitive health outcomes, you can see how important it is to mitigate. What we also did, though, is look not just at mitigation, we also looked at adaptation. We had 3 scenarios of adaptation. The columns on the left of each set are worlds with high challenges to adaptation and high challenges to mitigation. The middle column is where there is incomplete adaptation, kind of following along what we're currently doing, do some things well, some things not so well, things are delayed. And the column on the right is where the world aims for sustainable development. So there is a real interaction here, as you see across these, between adaptation and mitigation. The incomplete and proactive adaptation are truncated at the temperature projected by Working Group 1 that will occur in 2100. There's a very long list of effective adaptation options. This is just to get a discussion started about the long list of possibilities we have for really increasing the resilience of our health systems and protecting and promoting human health and well-being. As noted before, a major constraint is limited investment. When you look at the investments in the adaptation funds under the UNFCCC, less than 0.5% go to health. There's progress being made in national adaptation plans. There is an annual, semi-annual survey put together by the World Health Organization. And the latest one shows that about half of the 91 countries that reported have some kind of national strategy or plan in place. But again, human and financial resources are really constraining implementation. I see there's a comment in the chat. Okay, I guess I'm nearing my time, so I will run through these quickly. This is just some examples. You're going to hear more about heat. I do want to note, to build on the previous talk, that with heat inequity is a very big issue. And I just want to end with saying health co-benefits are incredibly important. That when you look at mitigation policies and technologies, all of them have significant health benefits. And when you add up the avoided hospitalizations, you add up the avoided premature deaths, and you value them, the value of the benefits of mitigation for our health are of the same order of magnitude or larger than the cost of mitigation. We should be mitigating for our health. Skip the research needs and end with saying that about 85% of the health risks of a changing climate are in children. So when we think about climate change and health, we should think about them. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much. That was great. And now our third speaker, Steve Lightman, is coming right up. Great. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone in the live audience and online as well. So I'm a longtime bioethicist and an aspiring recent convert to environmental ethics teaching and a recovering attorney. So I'm going to say something in each of those roles in a few comments that I think are mostly going to serve the function of filling in, because we've got an amazing amount of background on a broad range of the issues. I'm just going to add a few comments here and there from a number of different kinds of perspectives. When environmental ethics was being founded, say roughly 1970, one of the big problems with it as a field was that most of kind of ethical theories that we had around weren't very good at being applied to the environment. They were generally aimed at telling people how to treat one another. So if you're a good Kantian, for example, hardly anything in the natural world counted as a subject for moral discourse. If you were a good utilitarian, maybe you could worry about the fact that squirrels felt pain, but you certainly didn't have much space in your ethical theory for trees, let alone abstract entities like ecosystems or species. Right? So a bunch of the founders of environmental ethics in the late 60s and early 70s, I'm thinking people like Holmes Ralston or Barrett Collicott, or a little bit earlier than that, Aldo Leopold in the San County Almanac from 1949. We're looking for theories of environmental value that could reach and give and value in itself or in themselves non-human entities out there in the world. My sense, and I lament this, is that the current climate change crisis has done away with that effort. We're only thinking about humans now, pretty much, because the kind of global emergency that we're in, thanks to climate change, is focusing so much attention on human health outcomes, and I would say human security outcomes, because we are anticipating tens of millions, possibly 100 million climate migrants in the next couple of decades, which will have not only all kinds of healthcare consequences for those people, but lots of international security consequences and political consequences as migrants from one place coming into another are met with tides of resisting nationalism and so on. So there's a lot to worry about from the purely human perspective. But let me just point out that the health effects of climate change are not only felt by human beings, right? The longer season for ticks is killing moose by draining them of blood in Maine. Increased heat, particularly increased ocean heat, is bleaching out coral. Whales arrive in the Arctic and discover that they have missed their normal season for feeding because the warmer Arctic water has caused the algal bloom to occur a month earlier than it used to. And the whales, following their typical migration patterns, arrive too late to find that feast. So animals, not only us, are actually experiencing health effects that include heat-related disease, food insecurity, trauma, enhancement of pre-existing conditions, and even migration in response to climate change. So I just wanted to point that out. I also want to point out that, as several people have really wonderfully said and given good illustration of, climate change, like pandemic, is a magnifier of injustice. The effects land on the least well-off. We've seen, this morning, we've seen several illustrations of that here in the United States, but I wanted to underline what I think everyone already knows, that it's also true globally, that the effects of climate change are felt in the global scale, predominantly in the global south, within the global south, predominantly in communities that have very few resources. So this magnification of injustice is a global phenomenon, and we will see more of that as the impacts of climate change do cause more mass migration from things like food insecurity problems, and especially from coastal flooding and storm events around coastal flooding. So it's a pretty grim picture in a lot of ways. But now let me put my recovering attorney hat on, and just this is a real change in topic from what I've been talking about. Instead of general comments on the effects of climate change, I want to sort of get into what it is that lawyers might actually be doing about this. If we think about these sort of categories of mitigation and adaptation, and then the particular kind of mitigation called geoengineering. I think there are some really important opportunities for lawyers in particular to address some of these problems. Mitigation, the sort of classic mitigation, involves changing the way we produce energy, reorganizing agribusiness, reorganizing the construction industries that use less carbon emitting concrete. I mean, there's a whole bunch of sources of greenhouse gases from methane from agribusiness, beef. There's a lot of retooling of the way our economy works that needs to be done. And of course, retooling of the way we generate energy that needs to be done. And a lot of that will need to be done with lawyers, administrative lawyers, I think largely, but lawyers who understand national politics and budgeting process and can really try to help move the ball on those things. And also to some extent, international lawyers, because although most of these kinds of moves toward mitigation are going to be done at the national levels of a bunch of different countries, it's very good to put in place international treaties and agreements to try to get countries to keep up with one another and to keep their promises and to remain motivated. So clearly there's a role for a lot of different kinds of lawyers in that area. What I think is even more interesting though for lawyers is thinking about adaptation in response to, for example, heat or flooding events in our own cities. The range of things that count as adaptation, we've heard a little bit about how we can adapt using better access to healthcare systems. I would add, for example, internet access can be very important in terms of notifying people about the advent of heat events or unusual storms. About a third of our Medicaid population has no internet access at home, right? So keeping people looped into informational networks about what kinds of resources are available to them is going to be really important. But adaptation can also, besides being these powerfully local things that Tom was talking about, helping someone get the air conditioning, making the green space that cools off the neighborhood just a little bit more, those kinds of things, that can also be very invasive and intrusive forms of adaptation. There are already whole communities in Louisiana that are creating relocation plans because the land they are located on will not be reliably dry. It's already not reliably dry, and that's going to get worse. Louisiana is like Florida. Louisiana is actually already losing a lot of land every year and is scheduled to lose a lot more. So whole communities are going to be evicted by natural disaster, much as is happening with a number of island communities around the world in the South Pacific and in the Caribbean and so on. The land that they live on is going to go away. So for that full range of adaptation responses, we're going to need lawyers whose specialty is zoning, building codes, but also emergency response, people who can figure out new rules about how to relocate entire communities. And I think really, really importantly, people who can coordinate with communities about the things that they want. I so much appreciated the comments about asking people what it was that they needed most about heat rather than assuming that you knew. I think it's a really important thing that's going to need to be done to really consult with the communities, mostly urban communities in the United States that are most affected by climate change, and to get their input on how adaptation ought to be handled. And I think that's also an opportunity for at least some lawyers who are interested in urban planning and interested in democratic process. Last thing I'm going to mention is something I think that hasn't really been mentioned yet today, and that is the variety of mitigation that we call geoengineering. One kind is relatively easy, and thankfully it's being funded a bit by Bill Gates, and that is direct air capture of carbon. It is possible to set up factories that just suck the carbon out of the air, and that is a rather uncontroversial thing to do. It's expensive, It doesn't get you any return, so people have to invest in it just because they want to improve the climate. But that is beginning to happen, and I think it will happen more as people understand how much can be saved in terms of disaster costs, the more carbon we can suck out of the air. The more controversial kind of geoengineering, though, is what's called solar geoengineering. This involves scattering particles in the clouds, which could cause heat to be reflected back out into space rather than accumulate in our atmosphere. Putting sulfur particles is the major way that people are talking about. There's also a possibility of spraying seawater up into the sky above ships that are basically big pump ships. Seawater creates quite white clouds and would greatly increase the reflectivity, the albedo of the Earth's surface. And the engineering folks who are looking at this are quite optimistic that it could work. They actually think that a year and a half of concerted effort in terms of this kind of geoengineering could reduce the Earth's temperature to something more like normal from a few years ago. It could even improve the situation over where we are now. And it's not terribly expensive. It's the kind of thing that a single wealthy country could do, or that a big global consortium of wealthy individuals could do. It has some serious problems, though. One is moral hazard. If we can keep the temperature down without sucking any of the carbon out of the air and without changing our habits about the way we build things, the way we make our energy, we're going to be in trouble in the long run. So there are a lot of environmentalists, and there are a lot of well, I'll just leave it at that, who are dead opposed to the introduction of this sort of thing. On the other hand, there are people who are thinking that this could give us a bit of breathing space if these kinds of technologies were adapted. But to do any of this, or even to be ready in case we decide we want to do it, we need a whole bunch of law. And that's because this has to be done around the world for it to be effective. Different countries have different ideal temperatures at which they'd like this process to be stopped. There's a real danger if the process is started and it stops suddenly, that there will be a really rapid negative climate heating effect. So it has to be coordinated internationally. It has to be ramped up simultaneously around the world. We also might want to know who's actually doing it. This is the sort of thing that a rogue Bond villain could actually afford to do on his own, right? This is the sort of thing that a couple of wealthy developed countries could do and impose upon the entire world. And that's probably not the way we want to embark on this very hazardous venture, if we want to embark on it at all. So we need to set up international standards for how to conduct research on this in the next very short amount of time. And then if we decide as a globe whether to go forward, what kinds of limits we're going to put on it, what kinds of democratic accountability we can possibly impose on it, I think it's a really, really important question. It could buy us time to change our ways with regard to the climate. Of course, it could also make us complacent and cause us to fail even more spectacularly. But in any case, we need to frame a lot of law around it and cabinet in order to have it even as any kind of controlled available option. So I'll stop with that comment and look forward to questions.
Thanks, Steve. That's great. I feel like we've had talks of sort of a great range of resolution from sort of like, very focused case studies of, sort of very, sort of individual lives being affected, sort of big global phenomenon to the ethics and the geoengineering. So I really feel that this kind of sets up again sort of the day's panels very nicely to get a sense of how these issues are occurring, again, at all these different levels of resolution. What we're going to do now is we have a little time for some questions and discussion. The first thing I just simply like to do, I think Professor Abbey is also joining us for discussion virtually, is first, if any of the panel members have any questions or comments for each other. I always have things, and I don't want to sort of jump into my comments, but to see if you have things that thoughts or questions for each other first, and then to open it up to the audience.
I have a question for Sonal, if I
Yeah, please.
Sure, I'll try that. Yeah. When you talk to city officials or state politicians about what you're doing, do you talk about climate change or do you talk about heat?
That's a great question. We talk about a bundle. We say climate change, though unfortunately that message doesn't resonate politically as much as you want it to. We first and foremost talk about health. So if we're talking about heat, we really focus on the health impacts. We're not like, we don't talk about, oh, urban heat island. We're so worried about urban heat island. Unfortunately, politicians don't seem to care very much about that. But we talk about your constituents are dying. And that is what is a more effective narrative. Yeah, so that's why we act as very health focused when it comes to our outcomes that we talk about.
And just grabbing something at the table there. Any other thoughts or questions? I have, oh, please, there we go.
This question is for Sonal as well. I'm reminded when you were talking about the air conditioning and sort of the environmentalism versus the sort of use of the air conditioner. I'm reminded of that publication that the People Shall Lead from NAACP about local organizations sort of working with and also fighting with sort of big green organizations. And I want to hear sort of your take. How has that sort of played out? And sort of what were some of the challenges and maybe overcoming some of those challenges to work with larger organizations coming from a local organization? Because I think a lot of the work is being done at the local community. That's really where the focus needs to be, but a lot of the political or media attention tends to be on the larger organizations.
Yeah, thank you. I have probably 20 hours worth of thoughts on that. You've asked whether you meant to or not, a very deep question. In general, the history of the environmental justice movement, it began, officially out of the civil rights movement. It began out of an idea that very traditional environmental groups, conservation groups like the NRDCs of the world, don't care about Black and brown people. They never have in their policy. That's never been central to their work. And as a result, or not as a result, but what continues is Black and brown communities are the ones that deal with the brunt of environmental hazard and now climate hazard. The environmental justice movement came out of the civil rights movement as a very separate strand of environmental work, because basically people in communities like our executive director, who's one of the leaders of the environmental justice movement, said, we need our own movement. We need our own strand of work to address the fact that Harlem has 9 out of the 10 bus depots in Manhattan and a sewage treatment plant and a wastewater treatment plant and a power plant and all the highways moving through it, and the Upper West Side does not. And so it's been a many decades long journey around how do we work with big greens like NRDC and Oceana and Sierra Club and Earth Justice and these big groups. And in general, there's still a lot of headbutting. We fight constantly, but also there's been a lot of change from their side. I attribute a lot of it to the Black Lives Matter movement that has really forced a lot of people and a lot of organizations to confront their sort of institutional racism. And a lot of these groups now have environmental justice departments and like join our coalitions that we working on local issues like polluting power plants in Queens. And so that has gotten better, but at the end of the day, there still are a lot of disagreements. I think actually the conversation about carbon capture is something that is a big disagreement in the environmental, more bigger groups than local groups, because local groups generally feel like that is just allowing the fossil fuel industry to keep polluting. And ultimately, on the local level, the aim is not just to stop greenhouse gas emissions, but to stop local sort of racist siting of facilities, for example. So we do still butt heads on a lot of things, but it has gotten better.
So I'm a master's student at Tufts in diversity, equity, inclusion. And too often, Asians are left out of the conversation regarding DE&I and anti-racism. And also, I see a lot of organizations that leave our identity out of the picture in terms of environmental justice. It's great to see we, in fact, has seen the need for someone like yourself, merit-based, and to see in New York that Asians are part of the population. We've seen some of the hate crimes that have happened this week. How do you navigate in this space, knowing that there's a need to create more engagement, more outreach, and to ensure Asians are part of this conversation, just like today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like that's more personal than just about my organization, since we don't really represent Asian populations exactly, even though I am one. That is who I identify as. I think it's very important. I think maybe even Christy and Steve can speak to how categories of race is really misleading when it comes to climate and health exposure. Asian as a very big population tends to get reported as quite low for a lot of different climate risks and environmental risks. And a lot of times because, and this is true for probably any race category, but it's a huge variety of people that we're talking about. And so that's something that I constantly do, is remind people that the experience of a Bangladeshi immigrant in Queens that lives in an unregulated basement apartment is very different from like a wealthier person that lives in like a very fancy high-rise in Manhattan. And those populations are clumped together into one category. And so, for example, when Hurricane Ida hit New York City, there was a lot of death and displacement because of the flooding, where people's apartments, if they lived in basements that are not regulated, a lot of undocumented people live in them, they were displaced, and that was a hugely impacted, particularly the South Asian community. And that's something that I do find is not part of the conversation so much, and so it does take a lot of work to remind people of that. So I do appreciate your question, and it's important to sort of think about the categories we use around race not really being the full explanation of what's really going on.
And if we think about the problem globally, of course, South Asians, coastal South Asians in particular, are the least well off globally in terms of what's going to happen to those populations with climate change. And if we think about Chinese Asians, so many of them live in these very recently constructed mega cities that are going to have all the problems that someone's been talking about in New York, but in some ways even worse. So that, I mean, globally, Asians are among the least well off and are going to be at the top of everyone's minds in terms of populations that may end up having mass migrations toward the inland. All these kinds of issues globally are going to be really centrally about big Asian populations.
So, yeah, one more question there, and then we'll need to break, but yeah.
So I had a question, I think it's mostly for Christie. The likelihood of the loss and damage mechanism getting funded, right, and being a tool to address some of these problems. And then, if it were funded, or people thought about it, is there an appetite when you think about cumulative emissions for these European countries to sort of kick in to fund loss and damage, right? Because like if we think about cumulative emissions, it's like you start talking about Germany, Britain, and the colonialism and like thinking about it. And I know in Glasgow it was added in, but it's not funded. I'm just curious, like, what's your opinion about the likelihood of it getting funded and moving forward?
Thank you. That's a really excellent question. Of course, very difficult to answer. Several years ago, none of us thought you'd get loss and damage into the convention to begin with. And it was really quite amazing when loss and damage was included several years ago. There's been several years under the UNFCCC of studying loss and damage. And there is not the progress that the low and middle income countries need for loss and damage. But more is happening under the convention than one would expect. As you can appreciate, the high income countries don't want to have loss and damage. They don't want to be in a situation that is essentially they're being litigated for past emissions. But it's also the countries are providing lots of development assistance. And they're trying to understand the US has USAID, where we provide extensive development assistance. And how do you differentiate that from current loss and damage, from just basic development challenges? This goes back to the previous question, which I really appreciated, of thinking about sources of vulnerability. And there's hundreds of different sources of vulnerability. Where you live, socioeconomics, incredibly important. And very little about vulnerability, almost none of vulnerability is about race, except where you see specific marginalization of groups into places that are inherently more vulnerable because they're subject to sea level rise or flooding, or they're hotter because of redlining. And trying to disentangle this to understand what the climate change piece is on loss and damage versus all of the bad development choices that human societies have made over the last several decades. I don't know where it's going to go. It's now a field of scholarly research. There's more and more publications coming out taking a look at this. There's more estimates around loss and damage, and there's serious efforts to negotiate it under the convention. Good question on where it's going to go, though. We'll have to come back and talk about that another day. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. So we've reached another point for a brief break. We're going to reconvene at 11:45 with concurrent sessions. Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the healthcare systems and climate change panel is going to be up in 4:40. And the interdisciplinary collaboration with the National Environment Panel will be right here. I want to again thank our plenary panel speakers. This was fantastic. We look forward to further great discussions as the day continues. So thank you very much.